Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Luisa Del Giudice. She is an independent scholar and the founder of the Italian Oral History Institute in Los Angeles. Del Giudice has published widely on Italian and Italian-American and Canadian folk life, ethnology, foodways, and oral history. Del Giudice gave a talk titled Mountains of Cheese, Rivers of Wine, Paesi di Cuccagna, and Other Gastronomic Utopias on October 28, 2013, as a guest of the Folklore Program. Her visit was co-sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center. Luisa, thanks for coming on today.
It's a pleasure.
Tell us first, how does Paesi di Cuccagna translate into English, and then give us some background on the concept and comparable imagined states in European countries.
The Paesi di Cuccagna is a mythic land of plenty where rivers run with wine, mountains are made of cheese, roast chickens fall from the sky. That's the Italian variant. But we have it all over Europe from the Middle Ages on. And in England, it was called Lubberland, or land of cocaine, not cocaine. People always ask that. What's the connection? In German, it's Schlaraffenland, and in France, it is Panigon, or Paesi di Cuccagna. And it's basically an Edenic representation where food is prominent, but not only, it is also expresses the desire for social equity, and it's an upside-down world where everyone gets enough to eat. There are no tariffs, everything is free, and you are not allowed to work. That's the law of the land. And if you insist on wanting to work, they take you to prison. And there are palaces of pleasure, and you can imagine.
So in the Italian variant, I understand it's particularly gastronomic. Mm-hmm. Why would that be the case?
It is true for all variants, but in the northern variants, you get more of the social critique. So it's labor movements have used it and that sort of thing. But in Italy, I think it reflects a land of hunger, according to the inverse principle of utopian thought. So it's an inverse mirror of what was actually happening. Mm-hmm. And what was happening was basic bodily deprivations. It's a land of hunger. It's a poor man's paradise. It's being expressed in this mythic place. And it was very, we have very many variants of it, and you get it in broadsides too. So you get pictorial representations of it. They're a lot of fun. And the cantastorie, who were the street performers, would perform them. And they were long songs and with elaborate descriptions. So basically they were entrancing the hungry populace with these descriptions.
When you say a lot of variants, you're specifically talking about variants within a particular culture, in this case Italy?
Variants of this myth and variants of this place. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it is it's a walled city, and sometimes it is, I found about 13 prints of this place in the Getty collections. And these were designed by prominent architects and set designers for the court in Naples. And they were staged during Carnival time. There's a lot of overlap between Carnival and Kukanya, and then the reversible world as well. And these were staged in the 1700s. They were built, they were elaborate ephemeral architecture and plastered with food. So live carcasses and bread, and the fountains actually did spout wine. And so the 4 Sundays of Carnival, before the gaze of the royal court, it was really kind of, bread and circuses. And then the guard would give the signal, and all of the poor would just literally attack and take what they could. And it was, Marquis de Sade said it was one of the cruelest celebrations he had ever seen.
That's very interesting, because on the one hand, it makes perfect sense that these would be a kind of reverse of current conditions. So it's social conditions where the poor are hungry, so they fantasize this land of plenty. But what you've just said is very interesting. It suggests that the ruling classes opportunistically exploited this mythology for their own purposes.
In Naples particularly. In fact, in the 18th century, really Naples is associated most with this myth. And it, as it was then, it has remained a land of misery. and a lot of poverty. So it had the right social dynamics, the extreme wealth and extreme poverty for this to really. And in Naples, before it became kind of a royal festivity given for the people did it themselves. It was the guilds, so the bakers' guilds and the salumieri, butchers and all that. And it was a movable feast. So they had their own carts and then would go through the streets and then distribute all this food. But giving this myth of royal benevolence, so they sort of took it over and used it that way. But during 1764, a year of extreme famine, it became kind of riotous, and they had to stop it because there was a lot of violence, and people attacked not only the food but the actual structure. So that was the end of it. They kind of moved it successively away from the royal palace, and then it faded.
So you implied that the particular popularity in Naples had to do with particular hunger there, particular social deprivation. Is that the only reason why?
Hunger, of course, was in the 18th century was widespread. And in fact, those new foods that were brought from the New World, such as potatoes and corn especially, after they were brought to Europe, they really didn't take hold for about 2 centuries. And then in the 18th century, they were sort of forced, to ward off large-scale hunger and starvation. They started to cultivate these crops. And corn was just this miraculous thing where, just the amount of food you could produce from a cornfield was unlike the grains that they had been used to planting. So, yes. And Naples was... it was Campagna Felix from the Roman times on. This was the happy fields, the place where food grew, and if even in a place like that you have starvation, then there's something radically wrong.
Now, I understand that the particular configuration of these gastronomic utopias varies depending on the nation. So you've just pointed out that during this period of extreme hunger, the government is encouraging the use of grains and foodstuffs that are not native to Italy and Italian culture. I understand that the particular manifestation of the fantasy or of the utopia in Italy is lots of meat and cheese. Is that right?
Heavy on the protein, just exactly what they didn't have, right?
What they didn't have.
The inverse of the Mediterranean diet, which has become so fashionable. They were vegetarian by necessity, but if you could get your hands on some protein, that was pretty good. And so the Kukanya is just, it has a mountain of cheese. And it has macaroni. There's a cauldron on top that's spewing forth macaroni. And of course, if you think about the iconography, that is Vesuvius for Neapolitans, right? It's, it's just spewing forth. And I found other culinary Vesuvii as well, Plambodingola Napoletana. So this icon for the Neapolitans is important. And by this time, they were known as the mangiamacaroni, macaroni eaters, so it all kind of came together, but it was found all over. The Kukanya was found all over. What I find interesting as well is how it reflects culturally determined tastes. So in a Norwegian oleana, right, you're going to get sour cream and porridge, and in France you're going to get butter and chestnuts and stuffed pork. In the northern variants, like Germanic and Dutch and Northern European, you often have a pig running around with a fork and knife in its rump, ready for slicing, and pancakes. So houses made of pancakes and that sort of thing. In America, I mean, not surprisingly, given our addiction to sugar, we have the Hard Rock Candy Mountain. So in the hobo heaven, that's what you get: whiskey rivers and sugar mountains.
Sugar and alcohol.
Sugar and alcohol.
And whiskey in America.
Correct.
I love it. Say a little bit more about the role of the street performers in the construction.
Well, the street performers really were kind of not the mass media, but it was that borderline between the literary and the oral culture. That's what's so interesting about the cantastorie. So they went to the courts, and they were like exchange, stuff from the courts would go into the piazzas, the public squares, and vice versa. So they were the ones, because they traveled, they were itinerants, where the diffusion of motifs and song types and you know, these pictorial representations really traveled around. And we have a wonderful collection. We have many around Italy, but there's a collection in Milan called the Raccolta Bertarelli, so the Bertarelli Collection, and it has many of these broadsides in it. And that's what they sold, right? They performed it and then they sold it. It was the penny press. So for very low amount of cash, you could purchase one of these broadsides.
What role did the Paesi di Cuccagna narratives have in fueling Italian immigration to the United States?
Yeah, that's a really that's the interesting part as a historian of you know, cultural history of immigrants in the diaspora. I believe that this myth propelled, you know, it gave you the belief that there was a place where you would never go hungry again. It was always far off. They never gave you the exact location. It was always kind of, you know, behind that mountain, 6 months here by sea, and it was nowhere. It was nowhere, and it constantly was relocated, you know. But to Italians, and not just Italians, of course, when mass migration became possible, it was the place where the streets were paved with gold, and you really wouldn't go hungry again. And possibly one of the major differences for every immigrant's life was that it was a basic, you know, enough food to eat, at least. One wit in a documentary called The Italians in America says not only were the streets not paved with gold, they weren't paved at all, and the immigrants would have to pave them.
Yes.
So that's what it was, I think.
And how do these gastronomic utopias manifest once the immigrants are in the U.S.? So what are they? How does this fantasy play out in Italian American culture today?
Well, it really is a metaphor for abundance. So this abundance is a mantra for Italian Americans. It's always talking about abbondanza, right? It's more than you'll ever need, and it becomes a cultural practice. And growing up in Toronto among Italian immigrants, I was born in Italy but raised in Toronto, where there are like 500,000 post-World War II Italian immigrants. Just the amount of time spent creating abundance, recreating it constantly, so that it becomes almost like a daily practice. It's no longer just the festive time. You know, you pack your cantina, your wine cellar with food. It's this fear of hunger. So even though there is no, I mean, hunger isn't really there anymore, it's the fear of hunger, as Massimo Montanari, a wonderful historian of food in Europe, says. It's this fear that continues to create this kind of behavior, you know, like you can never have enough. And I've started looking at sort of the dark side of these practices, you know, the food addictions, the overindulgence. I think, you know, their cultures create their shadow sides as well. So if you do have that preoccupation, then you also have other things.
Well, you mentioned
going on.
The American variant is the Big Rock Candy Mountain, and you preface that by emphasizing the American addiction to sugar.
Oh, so, well, yeah. You know where it also, though, continues on, there's a thing called l'albero di Kukanya, which is literally a Kukanya tree or a pole. And you find it at many festivities. It's a greased pole. And at the top you find, you know, prosciutto, and you find cheeses and money and that sort of thing. So that's how it's remnants of Kukanya. But it's also gone, in this country at least, into children's literature. So you get Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs comes from that myth, and we're now in, what, part 2 of that myth? And other kinds of literature, children's literature as well. You
mentioned, I think in the Norwegian case, or that in some of the variants, there's a kind of political critique that's more evident here. In the Italian case, or in the American case, it sounds more like the myth serves in a certain way to placate the hungry. But are there cases where it serves a more critical political function?
Yes, it does. I mean, it is a laborless society, correct, where you're not allowed to work, and yet your needs are met. And this idea of triumph, il trionfo di carnevale, so this processing, you know, the carnival, fat carnival, and just kind of going through, was taken up by, in Italy as well, sort of not the hobo, but the la leggera, the kind of hobo mentality of, not working. And it became apparently, as Bruno Pianta, a historian of folk song, maintains, that it is behind the Italian communist song, Bandiera Rossa. So,
interesting.
yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. So let's turn in the last 10 minutes or so to your forthcoming edited volume of essays, Sabato Rodia's Towers in Watts, Art, Migration, and Development. Who was Sabato Rodia, and what are his towers?
Boy, that's a big question. In fact, we have a whole book on it coming up. Well, Sabato Rodia, who's known as Sam or Simon Rodia, was an Italian immigrant, part of that earliest migration, late 19th century, who came from Campania, that Avellino to be precise, Rivottoli di Serino in the province of Avellino. And he, was following a brother who was in Pennsylvania, working in the coal mines, died young, and then traveled west. He has an unhappy marriage. He does not really buy into the American dream, and starts wandering and ends up in Watts, Long Beach, Watts, Southern California, outskirts of Los Angeles, with a new idea to make something big. And he collects anything in the street, like literally just picks up what is to him beautiful on the beaches and the streets, along railway tracks, pieces of ceramic tile and shells and broken glass, and begins creating these structures. Some are towers, some are not towers. Some look like a gazebo and fountains and ovens, but he builds these amazing structures that many of us think, it was Dan Ward who first proposed this in the 80s, replicate the Gigli of Nola, which is a festivity just 50 miles from where he was born, and and they are dancing towers, and they're carried on the shoulders, 8 of them, the various guilds, with a musical band on top, 100 people, 100 men carrying these things through them. Anyway, what we did in 2009 and 2010 was have 2 conferences on the Watts Towers, one at the University of Genoa in Italy and one at UCLA and in Los Angeles. And part of the reason for doing that was to place these within the context of migration, which really, that narrative has never really been fully developed. And my particular interest was also restoring to Rodia his cultural, the ethnology, the background, the folk culture, because if you don't really look at that carefully, you don't understand what the Watts Towers precisely were, or at least one of the things that they were. And I think of them as, they are in the midst of Watts, which is was at least African American. It's very important on the site of African American, Black Los Angeles. It's becoming progressively Latino, but it was a racial, multicultural environment when he went there. Lots of Japanese and Blacks and everything, European immigrants. So, and the very art is a result of being an itinerant, like literally walking the streets and making something beautiful out of the detritus and stuff that had been discarded.
When did he build them?
From 1921 to 1954,
Oh, wow.
33 years, absolutely alone. And they asked him, why didn't you get any help? Because he was discovered after, before he died. There was a film student at University of Southern California who had seen a film on these towers and went looking for them and discovered they'd been completely abandoned, and then looked for the owner. He wanted to purchase them, which they did, and after they purchased them, discovered that there was a demolition order. They were to be demolished as a public hazard. Of course, they weren't. They'd survived earthquakes and all kinds of stuff. And then starts the saga of the Committee for the Simon Rodia's Towers in Watts, which is the committee that not only saved them, but went on to build a community art center and to help preserve them and all of that. And so when they discovered that Rodia was still alive, living in Martinez, California, they went looking for him. And so he did have his moment of fame before he died, but essentially alone. And he would just be... The process was an interesting one. He'd go to sleep, he'd think about what he was going to do the next day, and he'd do it, and then he'd take it apart and then do it again. It was like this process of building and rebuilding and recreating, but he wanted to do something big, and he sure did. you know.
So, how has the Art History Academy responded to the towers? I mean,
They became a cause célèbre. In the 1959 was this campaign, and it became an international campaign. So we'd get, you know, Lord Clark, and we'd get the directors of the Met, you know, and art, and the intelligentsia, from architects to arts peoples, all over the world. So they really became a famous icon, and it became sort of an icon of the little guy against the establishment and the non-academically trained artist, as opposed to, you know, the self-taught artist, to the academy, you know, the establishment of the art world.
It's one of the great outsider art
Outsider
pieces in the
arts,
world.
of course, yeah, or art brut. You know, the whole issue of what to call them is a big one. You know, art brut, visionary art, folk art, just, you know, it's been called lots of things.
So, how has the work been received and understood by the people and tourists of LA?
Well, it is a symbol of creative resistance, basically. And what has happened at the Watts Towers, given the example of Rodin himself, and it is an inspirational symbol of what people can do on their own, using their creativity, self-expression, and which is wonderful that there is the community art center. So that's what they're doing, you know, with the immediate community. And when they set up that center, it was a response because people were asking the committee, you know, that was responsible for the art, and these were outside of Watts. You know, how can you be interested in a work of art and not care about the people just outside the doors? And they struggled with that. They debated with that. So they realized that really you have to create a community not only that can appreciate the Watts Towers, but that, you know, can embrace it and learn from the example. And they have. It's become a wonderful center of, you know, music festival, the jazz festival, the Day of the Drum festival, community art, and it's free, you know, so the kids from the neighborhood, and not just kids, adults as well, can use those services, music lessons and everything else. It's really a very lively, and they have art galleries, so they're doing exhibitions all the time. And we've started to do some Italian programming there too. The director of the center came with me to Italy a couple of times, to that conference first, and then we brought the Watts Towers back to Rodia's hometown. And we did a presentation of, you know, kind of telling the people there what has become of their kind of native son that went away. And so that was an exciting piece of it too, returning.
So you mentioned just now and earlier in our discussion that your particular contribution or interest has been in sort of recovering the significance of the Italian diaspora and his role as an Italian immigrant. Have Italian American communities in Los Angeles, how have the Watts Towers figured for them? Have they?
Well, this is a new chapter, and I would say I kind of got involved in 2003. And proposed an exhibition on Leo Politi, who was another Italian Californian children's book illustrator and muralist, and did an exhibition there. So that was the first contact, really, with the Italian, you know, community. I was the director of the Italian Oral Histroy Institute there, and we have developed a really wonderful relationship. And so there's been, you know, there was an Italian jazz musician at the Jazz Festival just last year, and we did an exhibition on the Gigli of Nola, so that people could see, you know, do you think there's a connection here between these Gigli and the Watts Towers? And so I think it is a growing awareness, and I want there to be a sense of the common ground, and I don't want anyone to, you know, expropriate anyone else. And so I think it has to be done very carefully and sensitively, and you know, we have to work with the various communities that have an interest in that. There are many stakeholders in the Watts Towers, and I think that's good for the Watts Towers. You know, the more communities you have that are caring for it and to whom it is important, then I think that their future will be. And the Italian consulate's been very interested in it, and the Italian Cultural Institute. So I think they're on good ground.
But this is really a part of the story that had been lost.
Well,
it's been recovered.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think our viewers would already have gotten a sense of the variety of your interests as a cultural historian, a folklorist, an ethnographer. Tell us about one or two of the projects that you're currently working on? Both of the things that, the talk that you've given, you've been working on that material for a while, and the
Yeah.
Watchtowers book is coming out in June. What are some of the other things you're working
Well,
on?
I have three works actually. One is the Watchtowers. It's coming out in 2014. It's kind of going to be a magical year, I suppose. I'm collecting my wine and food writings among this in a book that would be published by Bordighera Press in New York next year. But there's a project I'm particularly excited about, and that is called On Second Thought: Women Scholars' Internal Dialogues on Profession, Community, and Purpose. And really it's about academics, or scholarly women I respect very much, who are not just head but heart people. So it is, what do you do and how have you lived your life as a scholar, bringing your enlightened self into your various environments, because I think there are many academic environments that are really deadly to people that are in them. And so, you know, how do we improve those environments? And how do we do good in the world, you know, because that's really the ultimate.
You want to give me an example of
Well, the Watchtowers, for example, in 2011, when we did this huge it was called the Watchtowers Common Ground Initiative, and I coordinated that. And for me, it was it ended with a communal table in Watts. And there's a tradition called the St. Joseph's Table. It's an open communal table where you collect food from everyone. You make this beautiful altar with braided breads and ritual stuff and everything. And you then feed whoever needs to be fed. And it reenacts the pageant of the flight into Egypt and all that. You know, it's the welcoming of the stranger, the feeding of the poor, and practicing hospitality. And so I thought, you know, there is no Italian community here, but this is something we have that we can give to address real needs, hunger and homelessness, right in Watts. And we co-created it with the Watchtowers Art Center and the residents. And it was done in a church with a huge population of recently arrived migrants. So that whole narrative of the looking for hospitality was important, and communities that came together.
Great. Well, Luisa, I'm sorry to say that we're just about out of time. It's been great speaking with you.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Luisa Del Giudice, an independent scholar and the founder of the Italian Oral History Institute in Los Angeles. Del Giudice gave a talk titled Mountains of Cheese, Rivers of Wine, Paesi di Cuccagna and Other Gastronomic Utopias on October 28th, 2013, as a guest of the Folklore program. Her visit was also co-sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center. Thank you for watching.